happened somewhere between 400 and 1200 AD. Most historians, in their books, they will put one chapter to this period of time. But it's really, if you study the step by step, this is a massive influential time. So, as I start here, oh, I think I'm disconnected now. Okay, so, it looks different here. Okay, so when people talk about the Dark Ages, this is often, or that middle period of time, they call it the Dark Ages. And this is the image that people think about a lot. You know, the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where there's some guy walking through the mud. They look like savages, and he's pounding, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead." And there's really no religion, there's no faith. And the only thing different about the guys who are covered with mud all the time, and worse, as in the movie, is the royalty, which are always clean. And they're always rich. And that's the message that is presented to people. This is the Middle Ages. Let's flip the page. Well, the word Dark Ages, this, I can't read on that side. The Saeculum Obscurum is the term in the Latin. And that should tell you something. It's a Latin phrase. And it means the Roman Empire had fallen to the barbarians, and the barbarians had continued ever since. Petrarch was a historian from the 1300s. He coined the phrase, the Dark Ages. And why is it dark? Because it wasn't Roman. Actually, Latin-led Roman. It had nothing to do with anything else. He was a historian who was pro-Roman, pro-Latin. He was not Germanic. He was not Frank or any other place. He had a focus of his teaching, and they were the highest point of everything. Highest point of philosophy, highest point of architecture, highest point of law and everything. And now we got barbarians. Everything is in the mud. That is a false understanding of what the medieval period or this middle period is. So we can go to the next page. It all looks similar. I think we went two. We go one back, yeah. The Dark Ages was also used to describe a period of destruction or a lack of new manuscripts in architecture. This is a period where sometimes you will read in the books, it works different. That side is edited correctly, and this side is zoomed in, I think. The Dark Ages. So this has to do with, sometimes people will describe this dark period as a time in which barbarians who did go in and destroy a lot, they didn't like the Romans. They didn't like the intellectualism of the Romans. They didn't like the pompous attitude that the Romans had towards everybody else. They were arrogant. They did not honor their agreements. They would make a treaty with barbarians and then, or some sort of tribe, the Huns or different group, and then they would cheat them. They were arrogant, and they assumed that they would always be in charge. And they had been in charge for as long as anybody could remember. And those who were not in their fold hated them for it. And so when the barbarians came in, they were not nice. They were violent. They destroyed everything, and they killed anybody who could read and write, which became a standard of these were people who, because you were taught in a Roman way. You were taught in a Roman school and with thinking, you were hated. And so the barbarians came in for that reason and destroyed anything that was intellectual, every library, churches, manuscripts, libraries, anything that was of significance, because they would take it away. They were trying to destroy the Roman culture. They hated it so completely at first. Let's see here. Oh, we got it. Okay, so next page. So also, this term, the Dark Ages, was used by Enlightenment philosophers. So you think about this, Enlightenment were the people in the again in like the 1500s. And they were Enlightenment philosophers, that they were really into the reasoning of the mind. And that humans have this high level of intellectual capacity, and we are becoming greater and greater. The beginning of the, leading to the modern period, where humanity will continue to grow. It is the humans that have the ability to overcome all obstacles and to ascend to all great heights. And so these philosophers such as Kant and Voltaire described an age between the fall of Rome and themselves as being the heirs of the Roman Empire. So they described this dark period. But you notice they just all drop out the middle, and it's because they want to say, we are just like the Romans. The barbarians didn't see it that way, but the philosophers, the religious in some cases, and the builders, everybody like that saw this Rome in its high point in the 400s as the pinnacle of civilization. I'm going to flip again. Charlemagne, when he started to rebuild Europe in about 800, is actually when he was declared. I think it's funny they actually declared on the year 800. It makes it easy to remember. 800 is when he was declared the Holy Roman Emperor, because he was returning to the days of the Roman Empire and bringing it to the West, and he was acknowledged by the Roman Emperor in the East that he was the leader of Rome. But just look at these dates. The Holy Roman Empire started about 800, and when did it end? 1806. Just think about that. That ran for 1,000 years. Now think of the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire is what some historians call it after a certain date, because they no longer have Rome as the head. But remember, it was them who moved it because Rome was corrupt. And they saw that. But it's the same empire. So it goes from 753 BC to 1453 AD. Think about those dates. We can't even imagine that when now we're coming up on these 250th anniversary of the United States. These empires had been around so long that they had completely rebuilt their cultures. When they say they were arrogant, they had been around by 400 AD. We're talking about, oh, there we go. Oh no, that's the outside. But anyway. That they had become so arrogant and pompous in themselves, politically and militarily, that they dominated everything, and everybody hated them because of it. But the Roman Empire had such, so even after the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, well, then there was another empire that started up in Russia, and they called their leader the Tsar, right? Which is short for Caesar. And their symbols are that of the eagle. The old Russia, they considered themselves the Roman Empire, continued on. That's one thing that often is described in a lot of history, is people have always tried to attribute and hold that saying, we are the Roman Empire, because of its incredible significance. So let's flip the page. And then, oh, it says here, I gotta read it here, the period of, dominated by the Christian church, and was of that of the feudal lords, sorry, my glasses don't work a distance here, as the secularists believed was devoid of any great achievement and was marked by the retardation of human faculties. That's actually, I took a quote from somebody. Can we flip the page? Enlightened philosophy and the age of reason came to fully replace the age of faith, says this historian John Dwyer, as he tries to understand that what they saw, what they were doing in the Enlightenment and in the Renaissance specifically, was returning to the sources, to the Greek and Roman culture, to rebuild society from everything that had happened and changed in this period of time. So they're describing this period of time as worthless and dark. There's nothing good but people wallowing in the mud for over 1,000 years. But you notice here he calls it something, an age of faith. Even this person who is tearing down this period describes this 1,000 years of an age of faith. And that is a way that the Roman Catholics actually describe this period of time, not as a wallowing in the mud time, but a period of high intellectual, religious accomplishment. We flip. Although you still have those who are not Catholic, such as Martin Luther and Melanchthon, who were from the Lutherans, and Erasmus, who was a Roman Catholic, who were at the time of the Reformation. That's why they're put in there, because they were Reformation-based theologians. They said it was an era of declining effectiveness in churches and church practices with children, youth, adults, leading to the ignorance of the key tenets of the faith, reduced piety, and increased superstition. Well, I think you can argue this towards the very high point, or the end of this period, closer to the 1300s, 1200s, is where we see a lot of this happening, but especially not at the beginning. Because that's exactly the opposite. You can't lose something that you never had. Back in the early church, you don't hear of, just to kind of a recap there, in the ancient church, we talk about how the Christian church did become a little bit more institutionalized. But how long did that last? Less than 100 years before Rome fell. From when it became authorized, first organized, and saying these are now part of the tenets of the Roman Empire, being Christianity, to when Rome fell. Less than 100 years. To try to say that, oh, Rome pushed Christianity to the whole world is not true when you think you had less than 100 years to do it. So you have to have something before you can lose it. They're making this point. It's a little overstated. We flip the slide. But what we find is instead of a fall, we have a breaking up of the Western Empire into as a whole into regions, and a rising of what they would call the Gothic. See, you know what Gothic means? Not Roman. It was a name like the name Lutheran was meant to be a put down. Baptists, a put down. Well, Gothic, it's not Roman. Like, it's obviously people wallowing in the mud. They're Gothic. They're Goths. Goths are barbarians. But it's also an entirely different way of architecture and of thought processes, of education. All this is Gothic. It is part of a whole movement, something that is not Roman. We flip the page. It might be hard to see here, but see, this shows the difference. On the left we have Roman, and on the right we have Gothic. One has great high towers that require buttresses on the Gothic side. Huge windows with stained glass to give you an air of the power and the greatness of God as you walk in. Have you ever walked into a cathedral and you sense the immenseness of them, the seriousness of faith? On the left, it was a little bit closer, tighter, and it was all about function and efficiency. So the Romans didn't like the airiness of the Goths. They were not efficient. We can just flip the page just to show the difference. They were very different. And Gothic is, unless you're from a Latin descendants, this is kind of your background. You see, it's a high, elaborate. So what happened, just as a quick background, is that we have the Huns, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Angles, the Saxons, the Franks, the Ostrogoths, the Lombards. They all took their turn smashing through the West. When you have terms like Vandals, You know what they got famous for. The Lombards, well, they actually took over Italy. The Visigoths went through Spain and through northern Africa. The Angles and the Saxons in England. Franks, well, the French. These were all barbarian tribes that swarmed in across the Danube or across on boat. And I guess you could have the Normans in there too, because they would be in Normandy. A lot of my ancestry, the Friesens from Friesland, were the barbarians, the Vikings who went in there and killed everything. That's a little bit later. But everybody took their turn because the Romans weren't actually defeated. They usually just kind of surrendered, and so up until late periods, there were Roman cities that were actually still Roman when it all fell to the barbarians, and they just paid taxes like everybody else, and they had cities, and they were Roman. Rome didn't fall. It just sort of went under new management a lot of times. There were Roman cities. And I think that's the thing that blew my mind when you look, and you would see with aqueducts, and just like they were Roman right out of the period of Rome, and they functioned for hundreds and hundreds of years, sometimes independently, and saying we just pay taxes to the barbarians, and they kept doing their own thing because they were better than everyone else in their minds, right? They'd been around forever. Well, where the fall began, with everybody taking their little bits and pieces, is these barbarians had a tactic. When Rome was falling, because they had had plagues and disease and population decline from all sorts of reasons. There are many reasons. And so the population was decreasing, especially in the West. They still had money, but they didn't have the armies to protect themselves anymore. And so they hired barbarians mercenaries to go on the border. So they trained people in combat techniques to fight off other barbarians, and then when they would break their deals or whatever, then they created their own trained enemies, a lot of the cases. So the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Angles, all these people took their bits, but what they would do is they wouldn't just come in and conquer. Barbarians didn't do that. These barbarian leaders, just to put them as, use the term barbarian meaning non-Roman again, or non-Greek, because that's what barbarian means. They would come in, take prisoners, take some money, take everything, and then they would go home. But in order to raise an army like that and get people all excited about going into battle and dying, a lot of times, is you had to constantly getting more and more and more money. But after a while, the Romans started running out of money because you can only kill people so many times. You can only take things so many times. And so these leaders, they would rise up and then they would fall, and they would rise up and they would fall, and they would be of different groups because you have to continually take. But they didn't hang around. Eventually they started to settle. So you have the Visigoths and all these people, and where this ended, or where it really kind of culminated when the barbarians started to settle, was a guy named Brennus. He was again, what was the group? Was he the Lombard? Anyways, he came down and he sacked Rome in 390 AD. He took over, but he didn't stay. So they don't consider 390 the end of Rome. He stayed for 3 days. And they paid him 1,000 pounds of gold. And what he did at the end is, historically, is he threw his sword on the scales, so that it would be 1,000 pounds on the scale plus his sword. And he says, "Woe to the conquered." So the weight of his sword above a pound. And that's what they had to pay before he would leave. So he didn't come in and kill all the Roman people. He just went after their gold. So he left. And then we had, in 310, Alaric came in and he sacked Rome. This is the official, in 410. He sacked Rome, he came in and he burnt it. And he destroyed it, so much so for hundreds of years. They were still rebuilding Rome. He took everything of value, destroyed all the anything of value. Anything gold, anything. It was a city that had been a ruling city that every road went to Rome. When it fell, it was devastating to the whole world. It was the stability. Now, sometimes we talk about in our American culture, well, what if the economy crashes? What if the government were to crash and all of a sudden you have no anarchy that takes place? There's no economy anymore. The Romans made peace across everywhere. You could travel anywhere you want, and all of a sudden now the barbarians basically control everything outside of the cities again. There was this fracturing of people's mentality. How can this happen? That the city that was the center of the world would fall. So Alaric came, plundered everything. The church is sitting there in there trying to function, and they're having the same problems. They're now separated. And then we have Attila the Hun shows up. Attila the Hun, again, another part of a family line, the Hungarians, the Huns coming in, again betrayed by the Romans again. They were supposed to have a daughter of the emperor in the west, and they refused to give their daughter to him. So he came down to take the daughter and stuff, and he showed up at the gates, and a guy named Leo stood at the door, the Bishop of Rome. And he said, "Go home." And they said, "No, we came here, actually we need food," because Alaric had no food for his people. And he said, "Okay, you can take whatever you want, but don't kill anybody." And Attila agreed. After crushing the armies of the Romans, conquering and sacking all the north, he just went home. The church stepped in. Historians will say there was a meeting and Attila went home. You can say what you want, but this is one of those, the church now was the power and the authority. And part of the story, though, is that Alaric had died just after he sacked Rome. So there was fear that it was the church that did that to him. The church prayed against him being a barbarian. And Attila was now part of this group that were part of the huge missionary movement of the church. So we have what happened at the Council of Nicaea is Arius, the Arians were defeated, and they said Jesus was truly God. Well, the Arians got defeated, and so they, as missionaries, flew out of Rome. And they went to all the barbarian tribes, the Huns, the Vandals, the Franks, and all the people that were not part of Rome. And they began to give this Christianized, non-Roman sect. And that's what a lot of it was. They wanted Christianity, but they couldn't stand Roman theology. So they embraced Arianism. And all the barbarian tribes that were ransacking Rome and the Western Empire in the West were Arians. Part of this Christian group. That was probably one of the greatest missionary endeavors that the church has ever had. Within a very short period of time, these non-Orthodox, non-Catholic missionaries went out and converted all of Europe. All the barbarians in these areas, are huge portions of them, so that they all said they were Christian. Now, I'm not going to go into the theology behind it. That can be talked about some other time. But this was probably the greatest push of Christian evangelism. And they weren't necessarily hostile towards Nicene Christianity. They just didn't know of it. So as they came in, they began to settle and try to take over. So let's flip the page as we get to... Well, through this whole time, the Eastern Empire basically abandoned the West. They didn't come and send armies. They didn't help anybody out. And the Eastern Europe was Greek-speaking, the east side. Now we've got all this area. We've got the Eastern Church, the Orthodox. That's actually where they come from. And the Western side, the Catholic Church, the Latins. So the people in the West, not only have their world been shattered because the religious head in Rome, as well as the cultural end in Rome, was broken, and then the Greeks didn't come and help them.
So the Eastern Empire would be like the Eastern Orthodox Church today, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. How about the Coptic Church?
They were separate.
Okay.
Yeah, they have since joined back. But
Okay.
back then they weren't. No, because they're monophysite. They actually have a different understanding of Jesus.
Okay.
So they were always a little bit kicked out. So the church then filled in the West when Leo stepped up. The church began to fill that vacuum because all the leaders in the West, there was no stability. They started gaining more and more and more power. Not because they necessarily were looking for it, but there were no great leaders bringing stability to people's lives. They stepped in when everybody needed it and began to take care of the poor, take care of rebuilding society when the governments couldn't. There was no one there, and they just started taking over. So flip the page. Now here's the question, because all these leaders sort of started to rebuild culture. Remember, they hated the Romans, and they were now Arians, Christians. And they had to rebuild society. Think about that. How would you, if you were asked by a willing population who are also Christians, saying, create Christendom, heaven on earth now. We give you absolute power to do this. Just think about that. Because that's what happened. These kings and warlords and leaders, they were Christian, or learning to be Christian, with Christian populations, and they wanted to rebuild things a certain way in different areas, but they were rebuilding what does it mean to have a full Christian society. Now just think about it. How would you do it? What would you implement? Now just think of our church here, is that I can see, because of my historical a little bit, I can see that there is certain elements of the service that are done and certain elements that are not done. Some things are brought out, such as each person having the priesthood of all believers is really affirmed in this church. And I've also noticed that I haven't seen Mark ever push his position as head elder or pastor on people. He takes a very humble approach to it. No, that is a cultural way that this church functions. I hope I'm getting a proper evaluation of this congregation. And that's a little different than what you find in other churches around, even in this community. So this church has, in this ability, has tried to create a certain kind of church with certain objectives. But that's not the same as every other church in the area. Well, back here, they had to rebuild not just a church, but an entire society and culture, legal system, education system. Everything had to be rebuilt as if it is now Christian. This is a huge task. Now, just try to imagine. Now, do you think everybody's going to agree with your interpretation of how society should look? Probably not. In fact, I think that most people will look back at the medieval period and say, you know, we don't really like what they did here. But they were filling the void as fast as they can. There was this running to try to keep up and build society. So if we flip page here, they saw themselves, because of the craziness of this whole political, economic world falling apart, they wanted to create a society that was more or less a little bit peaceful and static. It was on purpose. Instead of having just the Roman soldiers or political leaders, soldiers, and then there were slaves, well, they have this. You've got rulers who also were soldiers because they were the knights and the lords. They were trained for combat. And then you got prayers. Something that's entirely new. A whole spiritual category got added into culture. And then you have workers. Now, there was a little bit of movement between workers and prayers, and sometimes some people who were of the ruling class would go down and they would join monasteries. So there was a little movement, but most of the time it was 3 classes in order to create stability. But they had religious people had their own place. Let's flip. Oh, and sorry, I was just going to go in. So they had their own place, but then they had to rebuild culture. Now, one of the things that happened is if you have to convert an entire population and teach them what it means, kind of like when we had missionaries who went into Africa, and this was a case where a Baptist missionary came in and he went to a chief. This was in Kenya, and he said, "Do you want to become a believer?" And he goes, "Yes, I want to become a believer." And then the whole tribe converted. And now he goes, "What do you do?" Because they all say, "But do you know what this means? You have to trust in Jesus Christ alone." He goes, and every single person says, "Yes, we do." And you think, well, the chief said it. Well, it's because they chose to, but still, now that chief has to rebuild a culture to be like a Christian. And he has to rebuild everything. So look, what did they do? Well, they brought Christianity into every aspect of life. There was Advent added in. Religious calendar was brought in. Pentecost. All the celebrations and the fasts and the feasts. What's the purpose of all these? Are they in the Bible? No. Easter. Christmas. All these were added in order to teach all the people what is Christianity and how do you live this life. Not just, what do I know? Some intellectual assent. But how do I live the Christian life and live in a whole community of people who are believers? Let's flip. So the Holy Week and Lent and all these are starting to get added through this medieval time. Added by the church, yes, but also enforced by the state, so that everyone would know what it means to be a Christian and to live the life. Now this is pretty massive. You know, this is in the counterculture of what we have in the United States. What is the first thing that they're trying to remove? All the holidays, everything Christian, so they can make it secular. So they went the opposite and they took over, yes, they took over pagan holidays, but they made them uniformly Christian. The whole point was to teach people what it meant to be Christian. Now, we can say, oh, I don't like how they did it. But the legacy of just this one act is pretty massive on the training of an entire people of what it means. So I'm going to flip the page. Oh, yeah.
So at this time, a lot of the people are illiterate, right?
Yes.
And so the way they can learn about these things, since they're not reading scripture themselves, is through these practices, through like the feasts and the practices where they learn about these certain things. And so I imagine, you can correct me, so one of the reasons why those believers at this time in leadership would take a particular feast that they were already using and then convert it into Christians is to help them in the transition from where they were into the faith. And to teach them, no, that's the old, this is now the new, this is how we are to worship the God that we are now serving. I'm just
good way of putting it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because they took the dates, the ideas, sometimes the concept of Easter, and they incorporated from pagan ideas or whatever. They never denied that they were doing that. We look back and say, oh, why would you do that? No, because people already have the day off in their minds. They're already taking it as a holiday. So instead of going to the other religion, the other temple, the other sacrifice, oh, they'll go to church instead. And it was an incorporation. It wasn't a taking over, some hostile takeover of culture, as much as when people become believers, they want to do something else. That's something I think that's really kind of lacking. Something I think you were talking about last week is having a lifelong Christianity that's day to day. We lack that in our culture. We have Sundays and sort of popping around of different days throughout the year or throughout the week. there isn't a living Christianity the same way as they were trying to create as a complete Christian experience at this time. They also have the idea, this is a different concept of spiritual communities and godfathers and godparents. This was brought in right by Constantine in order to convert society. That godparents were not brought in because they were the best friends. They were brought in, they had requirements. They had to know the confessions and the creeds because they were brought in to be like pastors for children. That is the law. That was the law. Constantine brought in the law. There were requirements for godparents. They were spiritual caretakers of other people's children. But you get that concept there? It wasn't just for them. I'm a believer. Now I go about my day. It was built right into the culture, this idea. You take care of children. You're planning for the future. That's something in our culture I don't see a lot. At this church, yes, with what Caleb did today, this is an evidence of an attitude of you're thinking about the next generation. You go to a lot of churches and they don't. They're thinking about, what does this mean for me? You don't have that. This medieval culture was always about the future, the next generation. Let's flip the page. There was a redefining of family, is what I was saying there, of spiritual communities. Lord's Prayer and the Creed were developed. There's a rise of communal monasticism. This is very different from what the East has. The East had these monastics that they would go into the desert and they would starve themselves and beat themselves and torment themselves, and they'd come out as these great ascetic leaders. Well, it's about themselves. And I think sometimes in our history books we glorify them way too much. When we've got now, what is the movement of monastics in the medieval period? Well, they're people who serve others. They're living it out in a communal way, dealing with their sins, that even if a new government took over and a new king conquered, they didn't go after the monks, because the monks served everybody. In fact, there was so much more food because these people were not demanding wages. And there was a huge increase of economy because the monastics, and they expanded and made the best wine, the best chocolate when they had it, and the best of everything, because they could dedicate themselves to the expanding of whatever they did. This is huge. It created, yes, we can say, the monasticism and the religiosity of it. Well, no, they took the Bible and they said, well, how many times do you pray a day? 7 times, because it's in the Bible. And so they did it. It was every single day. You didn't care for your own needs, but you have other people care for you. I think that from one of the movies, and I've heard it a few times now, you can't ask for something at the dinner table in a monastery. Someone else has to provide it for you. You're always thinking about others, yeah?
Yeah, a lot of agricultural innovation and science rose out of these particular monasteries too. Like genetics started there, and like the cheese making of being able to all sorts of different types of cheeses.
Crop rotation and leaving year of fallow, all developed in this time period by the monks. They completely changed the agricultural life of the entire communities. So the next slide. Come to the end of this. As the monks, it was part of their duty was to continually preach. You know, sometimes we watch these movies and they'll show like Friar Tuck, and what is he doing? He's sitting there eating. And they like to show that the fat friar in movies, but that wasn't really the reality. There were some, I'm sure, especially later on, as we get to the 12th and 13th century, but most of the time, these were dedicated preachers. And they went everywhere and preached, constantly preaching. So people would hear the word of God when they would go into town, they would go to market, they would go to church, they would go anywhere. You would have these constant itinerant preachers. That's what they did. We don't have that in our culture. A guy just standing out in the corner preaching with, you say, oh, that's a weirdo. That's just one of those wackos with the sign, the end is nigh. Well, that's what their society was. They had these full-time preachers. They went in the streets and in the markets and the houses of castles and in private chapels and cemeteries, and they brought Christianity to death, to marriage. There's no wedding ceremonies in the Bible. There's no real ceremonies for funerals. That was all added just during this time period in order to make Christianity part of everyday life. It's part of Christian culture. Want to flip? And this is where I put, and you notice I didn't put the Bible passage on purpose because I want to show it as historical, is that it says, for this promise of Christianity is for you and to your children and for all who are far off, as many as the Lord our God will call. Is that the medieval period was a building of culture as much as anything within the church, a forming of what Christianity and of what culture should look like. Of not for me only. Sometimes the intellectual, I think, discussions of the apologists and of the early church, they were focused on here and focused on the one person. They're always talking about, what does this mean for you? But in the medieval period here, there's this big push. Well, what does this mean for others? What does it mean for our children? How do our children get saved? And I know some people have, you can go in here and talk about child baptism or infant baptism. I've been starting a study on that a little bit more, and I've actually found some interesting documents that I'm kind of, as a Baptist, that were very interesting from the early church period that don't quite fit, because this was an article actually made by Catholics, and they're saying these don't fit. But it was still that mindset. Well, what about our children? How do you get your children into the church? And so for some, that was infant baptism. But then that wasn't followed. There wasn't just baptism. There was then training, catechizing, building. All this stuff happened. That training that went from when a new convert was made, and then they would go spend about 2 years or 3 years in training and then get baptized. Well, they started doing that for children. So that all people, all children would have a basic understanding of Christianity right off. That is a huge cultural difference. And I know we want to, sometimes we put down that, but everything that culturally, sometimes we pick on, well, I think in our culture today, we see holes. We see that our generation, our church is not being spread to our children. I'm just kind of looking at myself. I think part of it is because we've abandoned some of the traditions for different ways. And I think we can modify perhaps how things are done. I'm just thinking in general, not about this church or this congregation. Because we've abandoned, I think, a little bit too much in our, I know it's not quite iconoclasm, where we destroy, but we destroy the idea of Christendom, the idea of a combination of church and state. And so we've destroyed a lot of culture in that process. And we've made our lives a lot harder in the passing on of generations. And because I think that what we see here with Peter saying that the church is not just for ourselves, but it's for our children. And I think the idea I wanted to put across just for today is the medieval period, as everything was being destroyed, the first thing they did is says we need stability, and then we need to have this for generations to come. And I think that's pretty admirable. The first thing they did was now say, we got to rebuild. And then they rebuilt Rome again, but in their own minds. All right, any questions? All right.
Yeah, going back to, we were talking about the joining of Christmas and Easter and how that, I don't know how you word it, joined, how they took, I don't know about took it over with the pagan holidays or whatever. So Easter, originally what Easter, from that pagan holiday was the god Estar, the god fertility.
Yeah.
And they joined that to
Well, they used the
celebrate
day.
the rise, the death and resurrection of Jesus. They kind of joined that celebration.
Yeah, Christmas, the same thing. Just what every holiday like that was taken from a day in which people were already celebrating and just sometimes even taking the name, the elements, Christian eggs, bunnies, for Easter. I mean, where did it all come from? Fertility. You know, they were just, and then they would sometimes Christianize them, right? Because that's what people already knew. Why rebuild the wheel? When you're trying to change a culture and make it Christian, sometimes you pick your battles. I think is what a lot of it was. Pick your battles. If they're willing to, all people are willing to come to church and actually take their Christianity and their relationship with Jesus serious, and their life, birth, and their everlasting, you know, eternity with God. Bring them in slowly if you need to. And I think that was it was more of a pragmatic approach that just happened. Because you're rebuilding culture. I'll just finish here.
Right, like when the Reformation happened, and we settled here, the Puritans settled here, we didn't celebrate Christmas, and Easter, or stuff like that, because
Well, some did.
the Protestants threw that off as a pagan holiday, and then it wasn't
Well,
until
the Puritans. There's some Puritans, not all, because the Lutherans and the Reformed still have, and that would be the majority of Protestants, still had Christmas, and they still hold Christmas. Christmas trees and stuff comes from Luther.
yeah, okay, there was it wasn't across the board, right? So I'm just saying the people who settled here did so. So the Christmas wasn't celebrated here until 1800s with the play with there once was a Christmas as a popular play that came in until like the 1800s or something like that. I'm just
Well,
recognizing.
I've actually heard of earlier.
All
But
I'm
still,
saying was-
it depends where. Remember, the Puritans were not uniform. The Puritans themselves were a wide group. They were just people who were trying to get, to live the life now away from decentralized church to their family being the church is a way of, I would describe Puritanism, and then living it completely and fully as a family unit, rather than necessarily a church unit first. So it was family, church, and then they would join the church, but it started at home with themselves and living it out purely. And so sometimes some groups saw that, or people did that by eliminating anything that wasn't directly in Scripture. But that wasn't right across the board. Because there's huge mixes within the Puritans.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. I was just kind of going back to like the whole thing with Easter. It's like Easter and Santa Claus. It's like it's pagan and it's like, let's say, origins and pagan. It's almost seems like a distraction. Or like
Let's see, what is
what do you tell
Santa
your
Claus?
kids? You know, it's
I always put this, what is Santa Claus? Saint Nicholas. Saint Nicholas was at the Council of Nicaea. Why does he have naughty and nice? Because he punched Arius. He's a Christian. He punched Arius, a heretic. You know, and he gave gifts to people because he was a compassionate person. He gave gifts to buy back daughters from who were going to be sold into slavery with coins and stockings. This is all the tradition that the Eastern Church still says. You know, Nicholas was a person, and the basis of it is there in history. It has gone through multiple cultures. But I don't want to argue this. I'm not going to argue for dates. I'm just saying that there could be a historical argument made for Santa Claus. I don't know what the Easter was.
I was just thinking with Easter. It's just interesting. It's almost like how these distractions come in. Even today, we have distractions to get us off Christ and what the Bible says, right?
Yep.
So in the Bible, should you even celebrate, Easter? Just because it's or the bunny, who is bunny, all that kind of. I'm just saying it's almost like it's like a distraction for the understanding of like you're trying to just live as close as you can to pure word of God with the Bible.
I would say that's true. You want to live as close as you can. I also think that a lot of the reason why people brought in things like the Easter, as was mentioned, was as a tool for doing exactly what you're saying. Why was there the three-leaf clover in Ireland? for the Trinity and stuff. There were tools that were in the culture or immediately available for usually pastors or monks or leaders to teach. And so this was the way that they taught it, and it became very popular. And so, especially in Holland, that's where a lot of the Santa Claus stuff comes from, and the person, or in the north. And I've studied this, but I don't want to get unstuck on that for this, because we're talking about the medieval kind of. Yes?
So you said that the barbarians were originally evangelized by the Arians who
Yes.
left after Constantine.
Oh, except for
and
the Franks
Nicene.
with Charlemagne. He was Nicene.
So my question is, when did the barbarians, or so-called barbarians, when did they accept the Nicene Creed and that version of Christianity?
It was after, I think, especially when Charlemagne conquered them. Charlemagne unified a lot of the north and when he redid the Holy Roman Empire. He came and he moved through, and as he moved through, there was a big conversion push for the Nicene, but it was all right after the 800 to 900. Usually they say about 1850 to 900, the Arians were gone. See, Arianism is based upon, it meets a barbarian mindset, but when people have a different educational level, they don't want to be empowered. See, Arianism has the Holy Spirit empowered and turned Jesus into the Christ by an adoptionist idea. And so I think that the barbarian, the idea of you have to overcome because their world was harsher, and so the idea of the Holy Spirit empowering them to overcome all their obstacles and make them stronger as people was a little bit more appealing. That is actually something that I remember being about 19 years old and studying Arianism and trying to think, why in the world would anybody accept this? And I could only think it had to do with the barbarian idea of strengthening themselves, of being overcoming all obstacles through an empowering. Yep.
I remember learning in biology class about Gregor Mendel, and that his family didn't have money, but the monks really supported scientific endeavors, so he went there, and he's, have you ever heard of Mendel's peas? That's what it's from. He
Okay.
studied about dominant and recessive traits in peas. So, do you know how the church at the time really saw science and looking at knowledge in that way?
To be honest, it's something I would say they didn't see themselves as contrary because it was God's creation.
Right.
And so to understand creation, there's no contradiction between science and religion. That was created by the humanists in that period after, where they said that there's a war between religion and science. I don't think they saw that it was God's creation, He created it.
Yeah, I always saw it that way too.
Okay. Thank you. Great.